The Milk River Basin is a transboundary watershed that originates from its headwaters in the Rocky Mountains of Montana. It flows northwest across the international boundary through the Canadian province of Alberta, where it eventually crosses back over into Montana and empties into the Missouri River. In 1917, the St. Mary's Canal was built for the purpose of diverting water from the St. Mary's River into the northern part of the Milk River to provide increased water availability to the lower Milk River Valley. For centuries, the Indigenous people of the Gros and Assiniboine tribes lived along the Milk River, relying on its waters for fishing, agriculture, cultural, and daily use. In 1851 and 1855, the Gros, as a part of the Blackfeet Confederacy, and the Assiniboine Nation signed treaties with the United States government that established their separate territories within the U.S. In 1888, the tribes signed an agreement with the United States giving up much of their land and territories that once included all of central eastern Montana and parts of western North Dakota to establish the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation in north central Montana. But as settlers moved westward in the late 19th century, conflicts over water use began to emerge. In July 1898, Henry Winters settled on land along the Milk River, upstream from where the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation was established, and began diverting water for irrigation. This required large amounts of water to sustain his crops in the region's arid climate. Winters claimed that he had no prior knowledge that the reservation existed, nor that the tribes had any claim to the water in the river. By 1905, the area began experiencing water shortages that prevented the downstream Indian irrigators on the reservation from receiving a sufficient supply of water for their needs. This dispute eventually led to the U.S. Supreme Court case known as Winters versus United States. The United States government, on behalf of the tribes, filed a lawsuit to determine and enforce tribal water rights. They stated that the tribes did not have the sufficient water needed for their reservation, since the water in the Milk River flowed first past the upstream, non-Indian irrigators who were diverting water from the Milk River for their own uses. The United States argued that the Gros and Assiniboine tribes had a right to sufficient water due to the 1888 agreement that established the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation on federally reserved lands, therefore making them federally reserved water rights. The upstream, non-Indian water users, including Winters, appealed, arguing that they were not notified that the Gros and Assiniboine tribes had any water rights when they purchased their land and began diverting water for their own use, claiming prior appropriation entitlement. They contested that without access to water in the river, their land would be of no value to the region's arid climate, and that the damage that they would incur due to this loss would be devastating and irreparable. Winters further argued that the reservation had other water sources, such as streams and springs, and that the federal government had not explicitly reserved water from the Milk River for the tribes. Additionally, he claimed that sufficient water would still be available downstream for the tribes after settlers diverted what they needed. However, in 1908, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the United States and the Gros and Assiniboine tribes, establishing what is now known as the Winters Doctrine. The Supreme Court stated that the tribes on the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation held implied federally reserved water rights. This meant that the tribe's water rights dated back to the establishment of the reservation, prior to Winters and other non-Indian water users settling on the lands upstream. This ruling prohibited upstream and non-Indian settlers from interfering with the tribe's water use, recognizing and reinforcing the legal principle of prior appropriation, first in time, first in right, which granted the Fort Belknap tribes senior treaty rights to the Milk River's water in their territory. Unlike state-governed prior appropriation laws, federally reserved water rights under the Winters Doctrine are reserved indefinitely and cannot be forfeited or lost due to non-use. This decision remains a cornerstone of Indigenous water right laws, shaping legal frameworks for water allocation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous users across the United States. There are limitations to the doctrine, however, as it does not explicitly quantify how much water is reserved for tribes, only that the amount is based on how much water is available and must be determined, which has subjected them further to political and legal negotiations. Today, the Winters Doctrine serves as a landmark precedent that affirms Indigenous people and their inherent right to water across the country. Since the ruling, federally reserved water rights have also extended to U.S. military installations, national parks, and national monuments, with the amount reserved regarded as the amount necessary to fulfill the purpose. Since these federally reserved water rights are considered to be established on the date in which the reservation was created by the federal government, this means that tribal water rights almost always supersede other water users in seniority. This provides tribes with a legal basis in order to claim their water rights with a higher priority than almost any other competing rights determined under state law. The Winters Doctrine is now used as a reference for many other court cases and rulings due to its legal basis, reinforcing tribal sovereignty and positioning tribal governments to negotiate settlements over water rights. While the ruling was a victory for Indigenous people in the U.S., challenges remain in enforcing and quantifying these rights. Water conflicts continue to evolve due to growing demand, climate change, and legal complexities. However, the Winters Doctrine remains a powerful tool for tribes to assert their rights and advocate for equitable access to water. As water scarcity becomes an increasing global concern, the fight for Indigenous water rights remains as relevant today as it was over a century ago.